name is Art Demopoulos. I'm the Executive Director of the National Hellenic Society, and we want to welcome you and our co-host, George Orphanakos, from the American School of Classical Studies, and some amazing guests. We call this series A Classic Couples, and these are more Greek than you and I, George, I think. These Philhellenes that have dedicated their lives to research and science and sort of cataloging for posterity the ancient Greek story and sort of bringing it to life for students around the world. We're going to have Maria show a short video that we produced with National Geographic that's just amazing because it takes what our esteemed guests do for a living and sort of brings it to the now and today and the relevance. So Maria, why don't you show the video?
One day soon, all of us are going to have the power to broadcast live what we're doing whenever we want, so that way our friends and families and people we care about can experience it as if they're right there with us.
The vehicles that made innovation possible in Athens is called the Symposium. This was a nightly ritual where 8 to 16 men would go to one man's house, and after pouring libations to the gods and drinking some wine and eating some grapes and bread, they would begin a conversation. Socrates developed this mode of questioning that absolutely requires social interaction. He couldn't philosophize alone. Socrates shared his ideas with everyone he met. So Socrates' ideas actually caught on through social networks of all those people he met. If you want to think of it like 6 degrees of separation, for Socrates' world, it's so tight, it's only 3 degrees of separation.
And their idea is that you can't do anything unless you are wise. So we shouldn't just catalogue the world, we should comprehend it.
Information sharing, it's unprecedented. At this moment, right now when I'm speaking, there's been more information sharing than there ever has been before. And when I say the next sentence, there's going to be even more. So that's going to increase forever, or, until the apocalypse.
Thank you, Diane. That was great. That's an example of how the ancient world's still so much relevant today. I mean, I know John Camp, the famous archaeologist, says, I love his phrase, he says, basically, nothing's changed, just the technology. And I think it's really true that nothing has changed. With that, I want to just a little bit about the National Hellenic Society. We're a proud organization of Greek American and Philhellenic leaders tasked to preserve, celebrate, certainly, and pass on Hellenic heritage to the next generation. And I want to kick it off to my co-moderator, George Orphanakos, who's Executive Director of the American School of Classical Studies, and all our guests have a relationship with that esteemed and wonderful institution. To tell us a little bit about ASCSA.
Thank you, Art, and thank you to our panelists for joining. We're really excited once again to have another episode of Classical Couples. We're going to get to our panelists and explain who they are. I'll just give a little bit of background. The first thing I do want to say is it is wonderful that we're here today, because each year we do find ourselves at Heritage Greece Weekend and the National Hellenic Society Weekend. And it's sad that we can't be together, but at least we are together online. The American School, I'll just share a couple things by way of background so you get a sense if people don't know, is a wonderful partner with the National Hellenic Society, and is a school. It's located in Glowacki in Greece, and it was established in 1881. So I think you can see the campus here. It basically has many different components, one of which is the Yannavios Library, which has over 130,000 volumes, including rare books and materials from post-antique Greece till today. You have the Blegan Library, which is a world-class library. We call some people joke around saying the Yannavios is for the Christians and the Blegan is for the pagans. So this is ancient Greece. This is our archives department, which is truly remarkable if you get lost in here, and that's Natalia. Over 4,000 linear feet of incredible archives from, Schliemann's papers, Siferis. You just get lost in there. And then you have the main excavation sites, the Athenian Agora, where they've discovered nearly 200,000 artifacts. We began excavating in 1931. Ancient Corinth, which we began digging earlier than that in the late 1800s, and over 90,000 artifacts discovered there. More importantly, you'll hear the story and you'll see different things as you get to know the school, that there were men and women, Philhellenes, not with Greek last names like Orphanakos and Demopolis, but much like the current Philhellenes that we have on the call today, Glowacki and Klein. See, we have two names there that we're sharing. And finally, you have the Malcolm Wiener Lab for Archaeological Science, which is a new addition to our campus, fairly new, that is truly remarkable. We excavate, we have publications and other things, but we excavate also all throughout Greece. And you'll hear more about this today. So that's a little bit of background.
So with that, let me, part of the problem of having people so dedicated to excellence, Aristotle said excellence is a habit, and we have habitual achievers here, is that you can go on and on with the introduction, so I'll be really brief. But Diane's an associate professor at George Washington University. She received her BA from Stanford, her PhD in classical archaeology from Princeton. She's the author of 2 books, including The Greeks, which is a companion to the National Geographic series, The Greeks, as well as the incredible exhibit that was here in Washington from 21 museums throughout Greece, thanks to Kathy Kane and Fred Hebert and a whole team there. She's won 2 Fulbrights, and one day I'm going to go on her expedition that she leads on behalf of either Nat Geo and the Smithsonian, I should say. So, Yasu Diane. Eric Klein is Diane's husband, and he's a Fulbright scholar. He's also a National Geographic Explorer, a Getty Fellow, a National Endowment for the Humanities Scholar. He received his classical anthropology degree at Dartmouth, in Near East Languages and Studies at Yale, and his ancient history PhD at my daughter's current employer, the University of Pennsylvania, and serves as a professor of classical and ancient Near East studies and anthropology also at George Washington. He's had 30 seasons of excavations and surveying in Greece, and has dug in Crete, in Jordan, Egypt, Cyprus, and currently in Israel, where he's overseeing excavations at Tel Kabri, a site of a 4,000-year-old Canaanite palace. He's a prolific author, several incredible books, and also will tell us about my favorite theory about the Trojan horse, which I totally buy, Eric. So wonderful to have you. And George, why don't you introduce our other 2 guests?
Thank you, Art. And I'll be brief as well, even though there's so much I could say.
So much.
Nancy Cline is with us, and her husband, Kevin Glowacki. Nancy Cline received her AB in Classical Studies from the University of Michigan, her MA and PhD from Bryn Mawr. She has done excavations at the site of Kavousi Vronda on Crete, and publishing a study on the Acropolis of Athens. Kevin received his AB in Greek and Latin and MA in Greek from Loyola University in Chicago, and his MA and PhD in Classical and Near Eastern Archaeology from Bryn Mawr. He has participated in several archaeological projects in Italy and Greece, and is a member of the excavation and publication teams for the sites of Kavousi Vronda and Gornia in Crete. And both are associate professors at Texas A&M University, and both are members of our managing committee at the American School.
I'm going to kick off the discussion for the whole panel. Tell us a little bit about when the light bulb went off and said, you know what, this is what I got to do in my life. Let's start with the Klein sisters. Diane?
Who else?
Diane?
Okay, well, I think you mentioned that I enjoy, being an expert on these expeditions to Greece for National Geographic and Smithsonian. And the reason for that, my real passion is introducing people to Greece, usually for the first time. So it's because it happened to me. I was 16 and I went on a tour of Greece, and we went to Delphi, we went to Olympia, we went to the Acropolis, and at that time you could walk inside the Parthenon, and that's how old I am. And that experience, that was it. I went back home to my tiny little town. We found a tutor for me in ancient Greek, in high school, and then I majored in classics in college, and off I went.
Where'd you grow up, Diane?
Eugene, Oregon.
Oh, wow. Wow.
Mm-hmm. West Coast.
Yeah. Nancy?
So I had the great privilege of growing up outside of Chicago. So shout out to the Chicago museums, the amazing resources of that community, and an amazing Greek American community in Chicago. And in high school, I took a course in anthropology through the National Science Foundation and the Field Museum, which gave us access to experts in archaeology and anthropology the world over. So my route to Greece was a little bit more circuitous: excavations in North America as a high school student, wow, England and France. And then as a graduate student at Bryn Mawr, the opportunity to work with my faculty members, with my professor, Jim Wright, who was subsequently director of the American School. And, the first time that so everybody who remembers the old airport in Greece, you'd fly into this tiny little airport on the south coast. And if you were lucky, you landed coming in over the city, and there's the Acropolis, right? You're looking at and it looks like you've just entered this world, which you've seen so much about. So for me, that was the transition point. I'd already committed myself, but visiting Greece for the first time was just confirmed. This is what I want to do. And so I've had the wonderful opportunity to continue that over many decades now.
How about you, Eric?
Man, unmute myself. And thank you all for inviting us, by the way.
Oh,
it's really wonderful to be here. I got started at a young age. My mother gave me a book when I was 7. It was called The Walls of Windy Troy. It was a child's biography of Heinrich Schliemann and his excavations at Troy. And after reading it, I turned to my parents. I said, that's it, I'm going to be an archaeologist. And my mom beamed proudly. My dad said, no, you're going to be a doctor. Obviously, mom won. And in fact, when I graduated from college with a degree in archaeology, she gave me that book again, and I still have it. It's in my office at GW. So that was basically it right there at the age of 7, but it was cemented when I was 10. We spent a year overseas. My dad had a sabbatical, and we were mostly in England and Australia, but in between we traveled for 3 weeks, and included in that was a trip to Greece. So this would have been 1970. And again, the Parthenon was not roped off, and neither was Delphi or anything like that. And so that really cemented it for me. So it goes way back when, and this is all I've ever wanted to do. So when I got to college, it was classical archaeology. I was lucky enough to study with Jerry Rudder, who was classmates way back when and colleagues, at least, with Jim Wright. So it's all related. It's a small circle here. And that was when I got to go to Greece for part of my sophomore year and spend the whole spring there. And then right after college, went to the Agora and dug there. And after that, that was it. No looking back.
Yeah. Kevin?
Well, you know, I grew up in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and I went as an undergraduate to Loyola University of Chicago. And one of the great things Loyola has is a Rome Center of Liberal Arts. And so I was able to go and spend an entire academic year in Rome walking around the city. Now, at the time, I had been interested in ancient languages, both Latin and Greek and other languages, and I was having a great deal of fun with that. But walking around Rome really kind of opened my eyes to visual culture and material culture and architecture and all these layers of history. One of the things that we did during our fall break for the Rome Center was that we went to Greece. So that was the very first time I ever went to Athens. And of course I ran around and I remember specifically going to the Agora because our tour group didn't take us there. And we actually stayed in a hotel close to Ammonia Square, which I'm not sure I would necessarily want to stay there recently myself. But I became hooked and I came back and I said, hey, you know, I want to be an archaeologist. But you know what it was? I want to be a Roman archaeologist. And so my thinking was this. If I want to be a Roman archaeologist, I've got to get my Greek archaeology up to par, and I've got to get my Greek language up to par, and then I'll go forward in Rome. So I started studying more Greek things. And then I was invited to an excavation by my professor, who I wasn't at Bryn Mawr yet, but I was invited to come to work with his excavation at Tsungisa, which is in Hellenic, and that hooked me on Greece. And then after there, I stayed in Crete. And still my intention always had been, up until almost I got my PhD, that someday when I grow up, I will be a Roman archaeologist. But somehow I've always gone back farther and farther in time, and the people of Greece just kind of kept me there, right? So that's how I've always been with Greece, and I love it. And I've been going back to Crete for almost every summer for the past, 35 years or so. So it's really quite an experience.
Before I kick it off to George for a question, I want to just compliment Diane. One of our programs is our Heritage, two programs, Heritage Greece and Heritage America. Heritage Greece, we send students to Greece for 2.5 weeks. It's much like the incredible Birthright Israel program. And Heritage America, we bring them here to Washington, D.C., and they're inspired by people in public life and in private life and sports, all sorts of, a who's who that talk about the impact of the heritage and the nexus in their success. And we throw them in a bus, and Diane takes us around Washington, D.C., which I think is more Greek than Athens in many ways. And she begins to tell the stories of all the different buildings. And I got to say, the first time I saw her do it, where our National Archives are, I teared up. It's such a, we as many of us live in big cities, and we don't know the treasures in our own cities, especially the impact that Greek architecture had in America in various periods. So bravo, Diane. We love it.
Thank you. There are these 4 monumental statues that are on the front and back of the building, and I take them 1, 2, 3, and the 4th, the name is Heritage, which is their program. And so of course we get the group photo there and then say goodbye. I did want to put in one more plug for tours while we're talking about it, which is the American School of Classical Studies summer session, which changed the trajectory of my career plans of my life, I could say. I went between junior and senior year of college, and I had been a Greek and Latin major. I was thinking of what Kevin was saying, just that philology undergrad, and went to the Athenian Agora. I mean, we went to, 150 or 200 different sites and museums, but that was it for me. And I met G. Leslie Shear Jr., the professor at Princeton, and I was a student of Antony Raubacek, who was a refugee from Vienna in, the 40s, came to Princeton, was at the Institute for Advanced Study, as many refugees were in that period, and then ended up at Stanford. So this was the good old days when we used the network. And so I went in and I said, when I got back senior year, I want to go to graduate school. Now I want to do archaeology. I really, really want to go to Princeton. And he basically picked up the phone and said, Bucky, which was his nickname. I have a student for you. They don't do that anymore, I promise you. But that's how I got into Princeton.
That's wonderful.
And she'll be too modest to tell you, but it all comes full circle because in 1997, she then led the summer session. So what goes around comes around.
That's
A
wonderful.
wonderful program.
Thank you, Diane. So we find a little bit about how you all came to the study and love of Greece. How did you find each other? How did you discover each other? Let's ask your stories. We'd love to hear that. We'll go to Nancy Klein if you want to start, and Kevin.
There might actually be a common nexus given where all of us were in 1984, but the very first time that I set eyes on that guy over there was at the Symposium for Troy and the Trojan War at Bryn Mawr College. So he was at Loyola, I was at Bryn Mawr. I'm like, who is this guy? And then the next year, we both wash up in Archaea Nemea, working on the site, the excavation of the prehistoric hill at Tungiza. And not to go into details, excavation is glamorous on the one side, but the challenges of living in a small village, challenges and benefits, right? You're in this magnificent countryside of the Carinthia, premium wine grape growing area, and we're living in the schoolhouse in Nemea. And the schoolhouse had one side on the right where the women slept and one side on the left where the men sat. And we had a very advanced solar heated shower, which was a barrel cut in half, passive solar heating, and a hose that trickled down to our shower every evening. So
I helped make that.
So that's where we first met and have successfully navigated excavations, dissertations, job hunting over the many, many years that followed. But yeah, we met as archaeologists, so it can work.
Great. Diane, Eric, how did you guys meet?
I'll start and then I'll pass the baton. So I believe that we overlapped in 1982 when I was on that summer session and he was excavating in the Athenian Agora. I believe that we stood in line. I was right ahead of him getting euros for 1 drachma. You remember that in the Plaka? But we didn't really meet then. I think Eric, but we kept, like you in 1984, we kept sort of being in the same place, but not quite meeting actually. So I'll let him tell.
Yeah, in addition to waiting for Souvlaki, a couple years later, it was 85 or 86, she was digging with Princeton at Paphos in Cyprus, not Paphos, one of the site where Willie Child. Yes. So I was coming through doing preliminary research for my dissertation and came through their dig, stopped for lunch. My timing was impeccable. And as payment for lunch, since I was a photographer, they asked me to take the team photo. And I took that photo and I noticed her sitting further down at the table. She didn't notice me, but never mind. So our paths crossed at that point. But Nancy and Kevin, I was at that Troy and the Trojan War Symposium also.
Wow.
So, yeah. So that seems to have been a kind of a defining moment for all of us.
We used to let Penn students come to Bryn Mawr.
Upon occasion. I actually had Mocktail Mellink's Trojan War seminar, which is where it would start at like 3 p.m. and end at about 10 in the evening with no dinner, no bathroom, no nothing. She's like, what are you, archaeologists or what? So, yeah, so that was a defining moment too.
You fellas both snagged the Klein sisters, right?
That's right. I feel left out here. I'm the only one without Klein. Although I ordered pizza, they want to know if I'm Mr. Klein. I said, yeah, sure, Kevin Klein. Why not? Send it to his bill, right?
Eric, did you have any photos from back then that you want to share as younger?
I could, at some point in Greece, there were 3 years in there, and this might have been on the left there. That might have been one of the tours that we were leading. We both led tours at that time. I was doing Elder Hostel a lot. And Diane was showing every senator that came through Chuck Grassley, and who else did you show around?
Bob Dole, and yeah, the U.S. Embassy had me taking people around, but this definitely was not the way I would have dressed for that.
But here I found a picture of you and Kevin at Corinth, I think.
Same dig.
Same dig, right? And then just to show that I really was at the Agora in '82, this is me, fully clothed. Okay, maybe not. John Camp, who you had on last time, for some reason stuck me down a well for close to 2 weeks of excavating. I've never read too much into that, but anyway, but the picture at the lower right is lots of fun. That was the whole team. And
did you find it? Did you find anything, Eric?
Oh yeah. Lots of mud, and some pottery, things like that.
Okay. So what are some of the projects that you have either worked on together or separately, Greece, Cyprus, elsewhere, with the nexus to?
We intentionally decided probably in 1989 that we would not work together. We keep 1,000 years between us, and we like it that way. I work on the
secret to your success
period, and he stays in the Bronze Age. And when he starts to encroach on that Iron Age, I get nervous. So,
right, we try and keep the Iron Age between us.
I've gone to a couple of his excavations for the summers. And he came with me on the summer session that I directed. In fact, we brought our 1.5-year-old. And when I would go off on the trips with the students, he stayed behind in Athens at the school. And the first time I came back, he told me he'd found a daycare center for her. And I hit the roof. Like, his job was to be the mom dad, while I led the summer session. And Jennifer Niles showed him where a daycare center was, and I'll never forgive her.
Yeah, I think it was called Bright Horizons or something like that. It was absolutely wonderful. So I was very proud of myself for finding this place, because then I could do some work too. And I put her in, and it was, she was being socialized. And yeah, Diane came back and hit the roof. I said, but all the best people are doing it. And indeed, about half of the daycare was American school kids. So, but as a result, we can say that Hannah's first word was in Greek. She said Zazu, which was her way of saying Yasu. So,
but inspired by the Lion King, the Zazu character. So
right. Right. Yes. So I have no regrets about putting her in daycare, but yeah. So we tend to go on separate projects. I'm off usually now digging in Israel, and Diane has her projects in Greece, because digs can be both very close-knit and also very stressful. So you either get along very well in a dig, or you should be on different digs. So either one. Yeah.
Right. And, I did a couple of excavations like the one with Kevin at Corinth, and realized it just really wasn't for me, the actual digging of it. I wanted a question that either digging or archaeological material culture would answer. And my question was, what was kept inside the Parthenon? And no digging would ever reveal that. And so I worked on Greek inscriptions in the Epigraphical Museum in Athens, where it's air conditioned. Thank you very much.
So, yeah, and I was going to say, Diane, just so the audience knows, like in the United States, when a federal agency passes a regulation, it's got to be published in the Federal Register. And I would presume that that openness comes back from ancient Greece, correct? Where you had a lot of the laws had to be, there you go.
Yeah, it is considered, well, I think it's freedom of information, that you can, go, let's say, to the archives, the Metroon and the Agora, and consult the records and say, yes, my property line ends here. We established that in a lawsuit 3 decades ago. And also to make public the accounts. And so what I worked on were accounts. There were annual audits of anyone who touched a drachma of public funds. It's one of the 3 parts of the Athenian democracy, this accountability, that every penny or piece of gold that was kept inside the Parthenon would be inventoried, and those accounts would be inscribed on stone. So that's what I studied for 150 years. 150 years of records. The other 2 aspects of democracy that we should really mention, I think, is rotation, the idea of 1-year terms and you're out. And that's to prevent corruption, which is very important. And then finally, along with their boards of 10 for every single job that we would have, there were 10 of them, 1 from each tribe. Those were selected by lottery. So just think about it, that being senator, being a congressman would be a board of 10 selected by lot with 1-year terms. This is the radical democracy. Yeah.
Yeah. And I know that when I visited with John Camp at the Agora, in the Stoa of Atalos, he showed me some of these incredible slabs of stone. And when if the stonecutter made a mistake, you just drew a line through it, right? There was no delete button. It's pretty funny because some of them were really made a lot of mistakes, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, pretty funny. How about you, Nancy and Kevin? Some of your experiences and projects in Greece, and have you worked together?
Somehow we just started working together and kept working together. But in graduate school, we both had Athenian projects. So when we spent our second year as associate members of the American School, we would leave Loring Hall, walk down through Glowacki Square. This is pre-metro days, right? So we used to metapodia from the American School down to the Agora. Kevin was working on a project on the North Slope, and I would make the trek up the hill to the Acropolis. And if it was one of those good days, we'd reconvene down in Plaka for those gyros we all think so highly of. But I think that because our interests are very closely related in terms of the archaeology of Crete in particular, we had devoted a great deal of time working at the site of Kavousi Vranda, which is in eastern Crete. And so we began that in graduate school and are in the wonderful position of being able to say that after 3-4 years of excavation, I think that I participated in, Kevin was there a little bit longer. This was a project under the auspices of the American School, and again, the Ministry of Culture issuing the permits that allow us to do this work. This prehistoric site from the late Bronze Age in the mountains of Crete was a great place to spend the summers. So it was no hardship. And although there was a certain amount of competition on site, right? So the workmen love working with Kevin, and he's got the good luck, right? The good fingers. And so there was a little rivalry as to who could find the best things, but all in the good sense of, we're here, we're having a great time. We had wonderful workmen from the local village of Kavousi working with us. And so that was a partnership that just worked for us. Kevin's had the chance to continue in the field, where I, like Diane, have gone back to the Acropolis, no excavation required. But we spent many, many summers in the small village of Pachiamos on the north coast of Crete, and really, really had a great time doing that.
Kevin?
Yeah, and I'd just add, that I found it interesting when Eric said that you keep the Iron Age between us, because the Iron Age is what kind of unifies us, right? So we've kind of stayed on that because we're both still involved in the publications of this site, and our team has put out 4 or 5 books now, and we've got a couple more in line. So even though we all have other projects, I went further back in time and worked at the site of Gornia, and Nancy went back to the classical period or the archaic period. We still have these common interests, and the great advantage of that, of course, is that I've always got a ready-made editor and proofreader. That's right there, so it works.
And I'm going to take advantage of the ability to screen share with one of our favorite pictures from the Paralia sto Pachiamo, which is our preferred method of spending the afternoon in the hot summer days. Just once again, acknowledging some of the great issues, quality of life, and benefits to being in this magical place and working on an excavation in Crete. So
the contributions of mythology in the modern context.
Mythos, mythologia.
Well, you can learn to read the Katharevosa on the label, right? So that's good. You're learning all kinds of good Greek.
Talk a little bit about specifically what each of your focus and work are, some things that they can relate to and understand a little bit, and why it interests you, and maybe what your present field work and your focus is, and maybe why you think that's important, or why people should really care about that. I'm going to back it up. I'll start with Kevin. I'll go the other way. Go ahead.
So, that field work that we've been doing in Crete is still a very important part, and I'm particularly interested in houses and how people lived on an everyday basis. And that includes how they built their houses, but then how they used their houses on the basis of what they left behind. So I've spent a lot of time thinking about that. And more recently with Nancy, because we both teach in a department of architecture, we've been thinking about the question of vernacular architectural techniques. And so we enjoy very much going into older villages that are either still inhabited and sometimes not inhabited, and looking at the buildings as they're still standing or even as they're falling down. That is, they're becoming the archaeological record. So those are some of the things that I'm interested in.
And what are you finding? What are you finding about, like, in your research about the houses and things?
Well, one of the things we talk about, it's always a big problem in archaeology, is how many people lived in a house, right? And how did they behave, and how did a house grow? Because in America, we build a house and we've got a certain ground plan, and we call the construction crew in, and it's built within a certain period of time, and maybe after a while we might add another room or renovate something or add something in the backyard. Whereas in a traditional Greek village, that what you'll find is you might start out with a 2-room house or a 3-room house, and then the next generation comes along, and so you've got the son and the daughter, and then you add another couple more rooms, and so it adjusts very much to the topography and the context and the site, and just trying to think about how that kind of social structure in a village grows from a family to an extended family to a village and gets larger, and how we might see that expressed in the material record. Right?
Great. Nancy, what about you?
Well, I just want to jump in and point out that, when we were digging at Cavusi, and I think Kevin's got some really good pictures of some of his team working that he can share with us, in particular, because we're digging in houses that are built in traditional methods that continued in use for thousands of years. And so we had the opportunity to work with people who had lived in traditional homes. And so their understanding of buildings, of space, or even we had one of our workmen knew how to build a traditional oven out of clay. And the kind of thing that kind of brings to life, this is a hearth, this is a place where people cooked, this was the center of the household. And even though it may have been 3,000 years before the ones which they lived in, this is an example of one of our workmen, Manolis Maniadakis, who on the left is the archaeological site where we're digging with the remains of an oven, and opposite side, Manolis is creating for us a traditional oven, which I think Kevin can correct me, Manolis' grandfather had been the village oven maker. And so a traditional craft, which obviously we can just go to Lidl or someplace else and buy our nice new appliances, but that traditional craft had been passed down and allowed us an amazing insight into how to understand what life was like thousands of years ago. And the bottle, what's in the bottle?
Water. To critical error,
Critical mavrokrasia. To doppio krasia.
Doppio.
Diane?
So I have 2 streams of research. One is the one I started as a student at the American School 30 years ago on the epigraphical evidence, that is the inscriptions which record what was kept or stored inside the Parthenon. So that work goes in fits and starts. Sometimes I'm really productive in that area, and sometimes I go off on the second stream. So Eric, you've got that one slide of Socrates for the second stream, The first, I should say, like my warmest memory I was there 3 years on the Fulbright and then 2 American School scholarships. And that the first day that I went for 3 years of study at the Epigraphical Museum, the first day I walked again around Lekavitos to the museum with Ron Stroud, who was the sort of resident professor for that year, for that first year of the 3 years. So anyway, we walked together from Glowacki all the way through Exarchia, you know, through the Polytechnic into the area where your National Museum is, if you're familiar with that. And of course, next door, tucked away, is this gem with pretty newly arranged exhibits. So I recommend going. But he walked with me and he sort of told me a bit of the history of the people who had worked there, these sort of greats that we all stand on the shoulders of for the epigraphical tradition. We went inside and he showed me how to work with stones. These are inscribed stones that have letters in them that are sometimes very difficult to make out.
Squeeze paper.
So he taught me how to do this. You get a bucket and some special chemical filter paper and water, and the top of that stone is an inscription, and you lay this paper down on top of it, and this was from just a couple years ago. And then you know, sort of get the air bubbles out like I'm doing there, and then
using this brush that I got.
Whack the crap out of it.
Like an octopus.
You're making an impression. We call it a squeeze. It doesn't hurt, but the first time I did it, Ron Stroud was there next to me, showed me how to do the bucket, how to lay it on, how hard to hit it. I was like, tap, 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 no, like whack, whack, whack. It doesn't hurt the top of the stone if the stone is in good condition. And so I made about 150 of these over the course of the 3 years. Now they're at the University of California at Berkeley, which is where Ron Stroud was a professor all those years, and he established a great repository or archive of these squeezes, of these inscriptions. I'm going to move it forward just a bit so that you can see. And
Wow.
a close-up. And those are the letters. I hope you can make it out.
Yeah,
You see?
wow.
Like almost transparent, because I really got it in there so it's almost pulp.
Peel it off.
And then it dries for a while, and then you peel it off. Do you see that crack here? That's the one that I showed you in here. That's that stone.
Wow.
That's unbelievable.
So that's the kind of work I've been doing on the one hand, and then on the other hand is the social network stuff that you started with.
The wonderful thing about inscriptions, I get excited when I find an inscription because it's the people of Greece talking directly to you after thousands of years.
Yeah.
Wow.
And then see what it is and someone translating it, and that's totally remarkable. And the second thing, which I'll say for some of our people listening, this was very interesting. I happened to be on a trip with our trustees, and we had the unique opportunity to go to Samos. And while in Samos, we were walking around and we were visiting different places. And much to my surprise, they visited a church. And as we were walking in this Byzantine church that they unlocked for us, John Camp pulled me over and said, George, are you still able to go into the altar? And I'm like, sure, I can go into the altar. I'll go take a look, you know. And he says, go in the altar and into the altar, and there's the table. And under the table, there's sometimes they're not covered, but this one was covered completely top to bottom. And he said, go inside the altar. I'm curious, lift up the altar table and see if there's an inscription actually on the stone there. So I walked in and I respectfully lifted up the altar table and peeked underneath. And sure enough, it was a full inscription of everything. And he explained to me that when they were building the churches, they would take part of the temples and they would take the best pieces from the temple to make the altar table. So I found that fascinating. and exciting at the same time.
And that idea of the Iron Age separating us, right? So Kevin has been spending his summers still on Crete and Gornia. And like Diane, I've come back to the Acropolis and Athens to work on a project that dates back to the time I was a graduate student. And so it's kind of an interesting thread that weaves through our lives. And part of it is based on the relationships and the connections we made professionally as graduate students. But my current project that I've been working on is on the Acropolis of Athens, right, which everybody knows. But while we understand the classical monuments, we don't always recognize the fact that, just like George said, right, the reuse of elements in an Orthodox church, taking the best blocks from older abandoned monuments, that the Acropolis is in fact built on the remains of the buildings which came before. And so the type of work that I do in the storerooms is putting together what is arguably the least impressive fragments of architecture and using that to recreate the past. And I just wanted to kind of give another shout out to the American School, and in particular, I'm not sure if I can get to this here, the fact that the resources of the American School, and in particular the archives of the American School, hold these great treasures, which we have a chance to use in our research. And so I think in George's intro, he showed us a picture of Dr. Natalia Vogeakov-Brogan, who is our archivist at the school. And when I was last in Athens working on my research, Natalia gave me access to the archives. And what you see on screen here is a manuscript written by William Bell Dinsmore, who was a Columbia-trained architect who then went to Greece and literally rewrote the book on Greek architecture. And while much of his research was published in various formats, a lot of his handwritten documents and even his notes and drawings are preserved in the archive. And Mrs. Dinsmore, William Dinsmore Jr.'s wife, has very generously given me permission to take advantage of documents which were created decades and sometimes over a century ago. And so, like Diane, we don't have to excavate to find new knowledge and to provide greater insight and hopefully give people a completely new view of something that I thought we knew the Acropolis, and the answer is we do, but there's more that we can uncover, even if it doesn't mean digging. So that's a cool thing that we do.
Diane Cline, it seems Eric has joined you and you are not 1,000.
Yes, we had a weird glitch.
Current work that I'm doing, actually, I think we mentioned it in passing at the beginning of the hour. I'm digging with the Sophists Orlando in the north of Israel. It's a Canaanite palace, almost 4,000 years old. But for me, the very interesting thing is that it is decorated with Aegean-style painted plaster floors and walls.
Wow.
So we are the second expedition that is there. Wolf Dietrich Niemeyer, who was the head of the German Institute in Athens for quite a while, and Aaron Kempinski from Tel Aviv, excavated there in the late 80s, early 90s, and they found the first floor, which looks like it should be at Knossos or Festos or Malya or somewhere else like that. And they also found about 2,000 fragments of painted fresco from the wall that look very much like the frescoes at Akrotiri on Santorini. So Asaf and I started excavating in 2005. The dig had been shut down for about 10 years before we started. And we promptly found more wall fresco fragments. And then this past season, which would be 2019, during the last week of excavation, of course it always happens in the last week, right? We found another painted floor. We've only uncovered 10 centimeters of it, but it is going to be another Aegean-style painted floor. So now we're trying to get up the funds, maybe partner with National Geographic or the Getty or somebody else who has experience in conserving and preserving painted plaster as we excavate it. So that'll be coming up. So it's it goes with my interest of international connections. My dissertation was late Bronze Age connections. This is Middle Bronze Age. And the interesting thing is the radiocarbon dates are now pushing us further and further back. So it looks like our palace starts at about 1900 BCE and is destroyed, we think, by an earthquake in about 1700, which means that our paintings, which look very much like Akrotiri, are in fact earlier, or at least at the same time as Akrotiri. So what that says about Middle Bronze Age connections between Greece and the Near East, it's opening up a whole new set of windows and doors. So very exciting. We're hoping the pandemic will allow us to be back there this coming summer. And if so, we'll be trying to expose more of that floor. So that's what I'm working on in terms of excavations these days.
If I could just add one note, which is that, people have been very interested in the heritage from ancient Greece for centuries, since the Renaissance. But every generation has to find their own voice, and there's still so much to do. And I think, Nancy and Kevin and Eric and I have all found our way to contribute new knowledge, but that builds on those gigantic shoulders of these greats like William Bell Dinsmore and Ron Stroud that, we've already mentioned. It's the work of every generation to find that new perspective.
Yeah, I know. When I had visited Delos, and I actually was with a Greek archaeologist, just who's digging an ancient kitchen, and I said, to him, I said, "How long is it going to take for you folks to find what you need to find?" He says, 100 years, 200 years, we don't know, and which sort of leads me, Eric, and I had asked the question before about unlocking this linear B, I think, is the hidden language, and then and if I may as well, it seems like technology. I've had the blessing to meet Bruce Hotzler from the school who's developed the iDig app, and it looks like last year I think there was a record number of underwater archaeological sites found because of technology with satellites and all sorts of, bells and whistles and technology. So what are some of the remaining challenges, and how does the technology help all of you in unraveling those mysteries?
Well, so part of it is both technology and just good old hard sweat and work. Linear B that you've mentioned is actually deciphered, and it turns out to be early Greek. Michael Ventris had already deciphered back in 1952. What remains undeciphered, though, is Linear A, which is used on Crete before the Mycenaeans get there. So we are still trying to figure that out. But there was a breakthrough announced just a week or two ago. It's not for sure, but it looks like now we know how to decipher some of the mathematical fractions that are on these tablets, because they mention how much wine there is and various other things. So there's a couple of groups that are working on that, mostly in England. And they just announced that they think they've identified some fractions. So that's one of the challenges that we've still got. The problem there is there aren't that many linear A inscriptions, and you need a certain number in order to figure out what it is. So that's a challenge. And they're starting to use things like artificial intelligence, not just in Crete, but also over in Mesopotamia and elsewhere, both with cuneiform tablets written on clay and inscriptions like Diane's, where they're broken, and they're trying to get artificial intelligence to figure out what it would have said. Like Diane sitting there with pencil and paper trying to figure out how many spaces and how many letters. But there have been some experiments, right, in artificial intelligence there. So,
right, because the inscriptions were digitized maybe 30 years ago by the Packard Institute, and we were able to basically get all Greek inscriptions that are known into one database, and then you can search for words and you can see patterns. Now this AI is expanding that ability to perhaps restore lines of text that have broken off based on the likelihood that it is replicating other known inscriptions. So that's what he's sort of describing.
And then there's all the stuff out in the field that Kevin and Nancy and I can talk to with drones and LiDAR and remote sensing. I mean, pretty soon we're not even going to have to dig. We're just going to run something over the surface and go, yeah.
Well, I'm waiting for the Star Trek, scan it from space and we'll get the whole thing. That'd be great someday in the future. But, I mentioned to George the other day that in the past 10 years, every archaeological project worth its salt is going to have a drone. Right, because the drone speeds things up. It gives you views that in some cases, I remember once a few years ago we were doing this at Gournia. We have actually done a photogrammetric survey of the entire Minoan city of Gournia, both from the ground and from a drone, and then have created this huge point cloud. And what we can do is be sure that we're getting views that are directly from above, but then we can also, through this point cloud, we can cut it and turn it around in space. And I remember once we had just, our team had scanned or had done the photogrammetry and had processed a picture of an ancient house. And as our friend Jorge Botero was doing this, he spun it around, and we realized, nobody in the history of the world has ever seen that building or that site like that, right? And so it gives you new insights. So it's not so much that it's a new technology. We still have to use our brains, and we still interpret in the present. But the technology can sometimes give us more clear insights. And then there's always the thing, one of the things that archaeologists, we spend a great deal of time drawing in the field. And we have to draw because we can't dig until we've recorded what we've already found or uncovered. And that kind of technology, whether it's photogrammetry or laser scanning, allows us to work faster. And then we go back and we check by hand. And even with something like Inscriptions with Diane, right? So that issue of making a squeeze is still making contact with a stone. So there are ways that we can use different levels of photography and imaging to create models that can be manipulated with light coming from one direction and then moving it from another direction and doing it on the computer. That again gives us new insights and maybe makes us see letters that are no longer there, or maybe in a photograph what looks like a letter turns out really just to be a crack, right? So the technology is giving us all kinds of interesting insights.
We saw that at an NHS conference that you did art when they had the books on Mount Sinai, remember? And they found in the bindings more unbelievable material. I'm going to downshift to something else. We're going to go somewhere which I think is very interesting. I'm going to say it, I want to preface it like this. When I worked in New York City, I went from the bus station through to 34th and Park, and I walked pretty quickly, got to my job, did my job, walked back and got on the bus and went home. And after a little bit of time, I started to realize, why am I walking so quickly? There's things around you that you need to enjoy. And it's what I call color. So when you spoke about Greece, it's funny how you talked about, you showed the Mythos beer and you showed the table. There's so much color. You have the food, the beaches, the history gives us color, right? You also, I think I would say,
and those crazy Greeks, George, those crazy Greeks.
I know, right? So you have all this stuff, but nothing gives color more than the people of Greece. And I'm curious in your interactions, if you've had any unique interactions, and I know that part of the American school experience is it's not just Americans behind walls. It's actually, there's a point where you don't know when you stop becoming American and start becoming Greek. I know all of you speak Greek, for example. So I'm going to ask you for some of the experiences with the local Greeks in the Greek community. And since I already know one of these stories, I want to give this a layup to Kevin to start us off a little bit. Talk a little bit about your experience with maybe someone that brought you some color.
Yeah, okay. Let me share my screen on this. I'll show you just a few slides of where we're working. So the site that Nancy and I worked at together in the 1980s and the early 1990s, and we're still working on some of the publications, is called Kavousi Vranda, right? So Kavousi is the name of the historic village, and this is in eastern Crete. And so these maps show us where it is, right by the Bay of Mirabello. For those of you who might know, down here is, this is the city of Ierapetra. down here, and Aias Nikolaos is just coming up over here. And so we've got the up in the mountains, so about 400 meters above sea level is Kavusi Vronda. And then I've been working after then, most recently, here at the site of Gornja, which is a Minoan city. Both of these sites were first excavated by Harriet Boyd Hawes in the early 1900s. Wow. And so the American school took the responsibility of following up this work by Hawes. And in fact, there are a number of projects that were done in the 1900s by Harriet Boyd Hawes and Richard Seeger and Edith Hall that other American scholars have revisited 100 years later. So with new technologies and new techniques and knowing more about Greek culture and the archaeology, we come back with new questions. And I think that's going to be important for the next generation that comes after us as well. They're going to have what Eric wants, right? Not digging at all or going from the Starship Enterprise and things out there, but it's fun to do the digging, there's no doubt. Now, when Harriet excavated, she had to come up to the site every day on a gailuri here. And so her workmen came, and actually this Kavusi project, even before Nancy and I became involved, was begun by Leslie Day from Wabash College and Geraldine Gazelle from the University of Tennessee and William Coulson from the University of Minnesota. And then later he became the director of the American School when we were all students there. And so in this photograph this must be maybe 1983 or so, here's Willie Coulson right here. And then here's Leslie Day. And then here's one of the Gaiduri or Mulari that takes us up to the site with equipment. When we were ready to dig in 1987, they had actually cut some bulldozed field roads up. So this was our Gaiduri right here, and the truck that Nico would take every day. And so here I am. Ooh, look at that. And then this is Beth Fisher that you heard from last week, right? This is Tom Brogan, who runs the INSTEP Center, and this is Geraldine Gazelle, who's very well known. And so, you know, we had these kinds of images, and this was quite an experience getting up to the site. But the person that sticks most in my mind is this gentleman right here, whose name was Yorgos Ekadachis. And George has an interesting story that as a young man during around World War II time, so this has probably happened just after World War II. He has got some good stories about having to go up to the mountains in World War II. Horrific, but interesting tales. And it said that he used to own the land of this archaeological site. And so one day he was planting a tree and he found a small tomb. Well, he did as most farmers do. He took the stuff out and he put the tree in, and then he took the human bones and he stuck it in a field wall, and eventually he remembered where those were, probably like 1989 he remembered where those were. But at the time he then took the artifacts that he found, ceramic vessels, and he took them to the Aias Nikolaos Museum rather than selling them, or rather than just destroying them because they're in the way of his trees. And he made them write down the catalog number and give him a photograph as a receipt. And George carried that photograph around for decades. And he became known in the village as the Archaeologos Anef Diplomatos, right? So he was always concerned, and his dream was to have archaeologists come and excavate that site someday. And so in the 1980s, late 1980s, we actually came up and worked with him. And George was an interesting guy. He was very lucky for the first hand, but, you know, a tough farmer, knew how to work in the fields, knew soil, and was great. He was also a little bit difficult to work with. So he'd come to work with me, and there were times when we'd work together beautifully, and there were times when he got tired of trying to dig stratigraphy slowly. He wanted to get down to the floor levels, and I'd have to yell at him no. So I'd yell, and everybody, and Nancy digging up on the top of the hill would say, yeah, we could all hear you yell, oi, Yorgo, right? Oi, you know? And it was, which is Cretan for ochi, right? So oi or oshi, right? And we out there. And one day we were coming down actually on this house. This is a floor a little bit later. This is the day after Yorgo did this, and he was in one of those moods where he did not want to dig slowly and stratigraphically, and I had to like stand right there on him. Right, Yorgo was also hard of hearing, had a hearing aid, and he finally got tired of me telling him no, and he clicked that hearing aid off, and I saw that. And he'd use sign language with me, right? He wanted to know if I wanted to go down 1 centimeter or 2 centimeters, and he wanted to go, can I go on 10 centimeters? And I said, no, George, you got to go down Pende Pontus, right? Or Dio Pontus. And he said, okay, and he'd pick at this. And then we came to the point, he knows that you're not supposed to remove stones, particularly large stones, until, we can see what's around it. And he would hit a metal pick and he'd touch it and it would kind of ding on the stone, and he'd look at me, okay, can I take that out? And I'd say, no, right, out there. And then he didn't look at me, right? He'd touch his stone. He finally got tired of that, and I could see him wind up, right, with the pick. And he pushed it into the earth. And just as he's doing that, I gave him a gentle little push backwards, right? And he fell down on his butt and out through the air. This pick brought up that stone and then the clump of earth that was underneath it. And it flipped around in the air and landed in his lap. And there was this beautiful stone Minoan vessel that must have been an heirloom from this house that was in it. And it flips into his lap, and he goes, "Nato, che." He calls me che, right? Nato, right, on this, And so he really knew how to find things, and he found this this pot the next day, and we've got our team working on that as well.
Thank you, Kevin. I think Diane and Eric, do you have interactions with the local folks that you've had? Uh-oh.
The spring of 2019 was my second Fulbright, and we went to the University of Crete. So we've got this Cretan connection with Kevin and Nancy as well. Yeah, go ahead.
Here it is.
Yeah. So we spent the spring semester. I was anticipating that it would be just like in the photographs, and it rained basically all the way through May when we left. So it wasn't quite that experience. And so luckily it was the people that saved us. I loved the people, and I had 7 students. I taught a seminar for graduate students on ancient people social networks. And so I actually taught them the software. You've seen some of the images tonight. These are my some of my 7 students. And then our host, the Philoxenia of the Cretans is well known, but she was by far the kindest, most generous person I've ever worked with. From the very beginning of helping me apply for the Fulbright, you need a letter from the host. She didn't know who I was. She was so generous with that support. And then once I got there, she didn't think that the office was good enough. She was upset that there wasn't ink for the printer. Mind you, they've had these austerity measures, and I want you all that are listening to open your hearts to the people who are working in higher education in Greece. The campus was just in shambles. They hadn't had any mowing for lawns in years, with graffiti everywhere. But more importantly, they haven't bought a book in years. The libraries, they couldn't buy ink. They said we'd have to speak with the Ministry of the Economy, to get ink for that printer. There were leaks everywhere, all the classrooms, because it was raining all the time. We noticed this. And then they didn't have a subscription to JSTOR, which is our lifeline now to get all of the journal articles that we need if you're not close to a great library like the American School of Classical Studies. So the faculty in the University of Crete, they have library cards to use the American School, but now it's COVID and they need that JSTOR and they can't get it. And it is heartbreaking. But what beautiful, beautiful people. And, all of these students, they work in the summer to pay for their expenses, and there were no tourists this summer. So COVID has hit Greece very hard. If you can open your hearts to these people and do something for them, if you have any connections in higher education, please help them.
So these people were so, wow, they were
Generous.
so nice, generous and nice. Katerina, who didn't know us from Adam or Eve.
Katerina Panagopoulou and Kostas.
And Kostas
Lasopoulos.
and all of their colleagues in the department. I went with Diane. This was her second Fulbright, and she got it to University of Rethymnon. First time I've ever spent an extended time in Crete. I'd been there many times before, but we spent the spring of 2019 there, and it now seems so idyllic. It might have been rainy and cold, but our apartment in Rethymnon opened right up onto the bay, and Diane would go off and teach. And it was terrible for me. I had to stay back and do my own research and writing because I was on leave. And it was horrible just being on the balcony sipping coffee and watching the sunrise. But they extended their generosity to me as well, invited me to give a lecture.
It's very sweet.
And we were able to travel all over the island. So in fact, we went and we went to Pakiamos and we went to the East Crete Center.
Yeah, we've never been. Yeah.
Right, saw Tom Brogan and everybody like that. So that was just a year ago.
It seems like forever.
It was a different world. Absolutely different.
You experienced what we love to call philotimo.
Philotimo,
Absolutely.
Philoxenian, ancient Greek, I guess. That anyone who comes to your doorstep could be a god in disguise. And this is a lesson from the ancient Greeks we need in our world more than ever, that the stranger, the foreigner is a friend you haven't yet met.
And what was amazing too, and you guys know this because you've been in Crete, but I've worked elsewhere, and after every dinner, out came the free dessert and raki.
And you could not get up and leave.
Right.
And it would be 1 a.m. and you have to teach the next day. Oh my God.
All of you are prolific authors. Wanted to talk a little bit about your books and maybe a couple other things. What you're most proud of, and what's the big thing, the aha or we say eureka moment for you? What do you want to find?
Both of us have had books translated into Greek, which is lots and lots of fun. And you see Diane, the lower left there, at her book launch in Greece. If I had one thing, I actually was asked this a couple of years ago when my book 1177 came out in 2014, and then it actually came out in Greek while we were in Crete. Wow. So we were able to go for mine and for Diane's, which also came out. I was asked if somebody gave me $1 million, what would I want to go look for? And my answer is very simply, I want to find out where the sea peoples came from and where they went to and who they are, because this is one of the great mysteries of ancient history. These people, the Peleset, are probably the Philistines, and there's been new DNA work showing that they might have come from Crete or mainland Greece or perhaps Iberia. But still exactly who the sea peoples are and what role they played in the collapse of Minoan and Mycenaean civilization just after 1200 BC would be my ideal goal. And if I could find that, I'd be very happy.
And for me, I want to find the secret sauce of the ancient Greeks, what made them so creative and innovative, so that I can bottle it and distribute it in the modern world.
Eric, you've got a theory about the Trojan horse. You got to tell us your theory, if it did indeed exist. I know there's like a 500-year lapse, but I love it.
Yeah. Exactly. Well, the other two can jump in too, since we were all at that same seminar there. And it's not my theory necessarily, but the question is very much what is the Trojan horse, or what was it? So one of the possibilities is that it's an earthquake. Another possibility is that it's some sort of siege engine or battering ram, something like that. Right. And then, of course, the last one is it really is a Trojan horse that they built by flipping the ship upside down, and the hull is actually the body of the actual horse. So, take your pick. It's one of any of them. What I like, especially, there was a new Total War video game that was just released, and it's called Total War Saga Troy or Trojan War. And in it, they have 3 endings and 3 different possibilities for what the Trojan horse is. So they didn't settle on one of them. You can play it 3 different ways and take your pick of which type of Trojan horse you want.
Yeah, I want to find the Trojan horse too, Eric. So that's always a good one out here. I think that as archaeologists who dig, and this is an important thing. Not every archaeologist digs. right? There's a lot of excavating we can do in storerooms and museums and in archives, and it's really important to have access to that material, right? But for those of us who do dig, we have a moral responsibility to see it through to completion. And I think that what lights my fire are the books that are coming out of the projects that we're working on, and because these are collaborative works, and they take a long time, and they take a lot of give and take back and forth, and yet we make a contribution to history, right? And we help other people see the data that we use to say, hey, here's our interpretation of this site. And that really gives me a great deal of satisfaction as an archaeologist.
Nancy?
So I remember when I first started on my project looking at the early Acropolis, and somebody said, where would you dig? And I just flippantly tossed out, under the Parthenon, which is never going to happen. But in terms of our sense of discovery and our technological abilities, one of the greatest potentials, I think, is to combine the technology which allows us to observe, to document, and to explore in ways that were not possible in previous generations, and then apply to that our perspective, building on what we've learned from the people in the past to create a new picture and a new understanding of the past. And all four of us are teachers. So we have this extraordinary opportunity every year. We get a new crop of, 18-year-olds who wander into our classes completely unaware. They're like, well, it contributes to core curriculum. I guess I'll take this. It's better than something else. And we hook them into this greater understanding of the past. And our passion and experience, which, for speaking personally, it's been a great privilege to have the opportunity to study, to travel, to form relationships and be a part of community in Greece that is the only thing that's longer is my birth family, right? I have known these people and been a part of their lives even longer. And so for us, the eureka is, I get to share that with the next generation. And as a teacher, to train them in new ways of thinking. And my great hope is they're going to take it even further and tell us things we never imagined about the past and the culture that we love.
Well, and when they plant an olive tree in Crete, there's a toast, and the saying is the toast and istinalienia. All right, so to the next generation.
Yeah.
George, any closing thoughts?
No, I just want to thank all of you for your dedication. I said this on the last one, but I have to say it again. Art and I were born Greek, if you will, with Greek descent. And we didn't really have a choice in it, but we've come to appreciate and love it. And you all are Greeks by choice. And on the, on the Yanadios, it says those who embrace our culture, they're Greeks as well, and they're to be called Greeks. So it's the same way. So thank you very much for your love, your passion, to learn about Greece, and more importantly, to share it. And to share it with the world.
Thank you for who you are and what you do and what you stand for, and for inspiring us. Thank you, George and American School, for the tremendous work. And can't wait for the next classic couples, but thank you all. And,
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And you're all invited to next year. It's the 200-year anniversary of Greek independence, the Greek War for Independence. We hope to celebrate it here in Washington, D.C., God willing, or the gods willing, and we look forward to seeing you all. Gya σας. Καληνύχτα.
Καληνύχτα. Ευχαριστούμε.
Γεια σας.